Steam rose from Ezra Holloway's coffee cup, curling into the dawn air like a question. 63 years had taught him to savor these quiet moments. The porch boards creaked beneath his rocking chair, a rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. Then he heard it, a cry, thin and desperate, carried on the wind. Ezra set down his cup and stood, squinting toward the eastern pasture. There, a flash of movement in the tall grass. Someone crawling. He found her at the edge of his property, dress torn and bloodied, hair matted with dirt. Her eyes, wide with fear, met his for just a moment before darting away. "Please," she whispered, her voice rough as sandpaper. "Help me." Gently, Ezra knelt beside her. His weathered hands hovered over the angry marks on her arms, welts and bruises too precise to be accidental. "Them marks ain't from no fall, ma'am." Her eyes fluttered, consciousness slipping. Ezra didn't wait for permission. He scooped her up, careful of her injuries, and felt her body go rigid with fear before surrendering to his grip. She weighed no more than a half-filled grain sack. "You're safe now," he murmured, the words awkward in his rarely used voice. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." The cabin stood just as he'd left it, coffee pot still warm on the wood stove, single plate and cup in the wash basin. A bachelor's quarters, sparse but clean. The woman's gaze darted around the room, assessing escape routes. Ezra had seen that look before, in wounded animals. He laid her on his bed, then stepped back, giving her space. "Name's Ezra Holloway. This here's my ranch." She swallowed, her throat working painfully. "Sarah," she managed. "Nothing more." "You need a doctor, Miss Sarah." She shook her head violently, then winced. "No. Please. No town." Ezra nodded, respecting her fear. Then water first, food after. He moved to the wash basin, keeping his movements slow and predictable. The pump handle squeaked as he filled a cup with cool water. When he brought it to her, he was careful not to touch her fingers with his own. "Small sips," he instructed. While she drank, he took stock of her visible injuries, bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh purple, others fading yellow-green. Methodical marks, not random, the kind that came from a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "He'll come looking," she whispered, her voice steadier after the water. "Who?" Her eyes dropped. "Judge Blackwood." Ezra's jaw tightened. Harlan Blackwood. The name carried weight throughout the county. A man whose word was law, whose property holdings stretched across half the territory. "You rest," he said finally. "We'll figure things after." While she slept, Ezra gathered supplies, clean cloths, the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, a spare shirt that would swallow her frame but cover her torn dress. Outside, chickens clucked nervously as he crossed the yard to the pump, filling a bucket with fresh water. The metal handle was cool against his calloused palm. When he returned, she was sitting upright, tense as a drawn wire. "May I?" he asked, holding up the wet cloth. She nodded once, sharply. Ezra worked in silence, cleaning dirt from the cuts on her arms and face. The cabin filled with the sharp scent of whiskey as he disinfected the deeper wounds. She flinched, but made no sound. "Your ribs hurt?" he asked, noticing how she held herself. "Yes. Might need binding, but that can wait for a woman's touch." As he tended her visible wounds, Ezra's eyes caught something. A pattern in the bruising, 5 distinct marks on her upper arm evenly spaced. His fingers hovered over them, not touching. "Judge wear rings?" he asked quietly. Her face went blank, a mask sliding into place. But her eyes, they told everything. "4 on his right hand," she whispered. Family crest on his smallest finger. Ruby on his index, gold band, diamond. Ezra's stomach tightened. Those rings were well known in the county, seen at every court proceeding, flashing as Blackwood's hands punctuated his judgments. "He showed them to me," she continued, voice hollowing. "First day. Said they were worth more than I'd see in 10 lifetimes." Ezra rinsed the cloth in the bucket. The water turned pink. "Miss Sarah," he said carefully, "those marks on your arm, they ain't random. They're spaced like fingers, like someone grabbing you, wearing those exact rings." Her eyes met his, something flickering behind them. Relief that someone could read the evidence written on her body. "Judge won't like what you've done," she whispered. The next morning came with no relief for Sarah's pain. Her breath hitched with every movement, confirming Ezra's suspicion about those ribs. He'd need supplies, proper bandages, salve, maybe laudanum if Doc Miller could spare it. "I'm heading to town," he told her, setting a plate of fried potatoes within reach. The fork clinked against the chipped ceramic. Lock the door behind me. Don't answer for nobody. Sarah's fingers curled into the quilt. If he finds me here, he won't, Ezra said, though the promise felt hollow. Not today. The ride into Piney Creek took nearly an hour, hoofbeats rhythmic against the hard-packed dirt. Ezra rehearsed what he'd say to Doc, enough to get help, not enough to spread gossip. This town ran on whispers, and whispers reached the wrong ears. Main Street was busy with the usual Wednesday traffic. Wagons creaked past the general store. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal, each strike sending sparks dancing. Ezra tied his horse outside the doctor's office, aware of eyes following him. He didn't come to town often, just supplies, church some Sundays. Kept to himself, the way most folks preferred. Inside, the waiting room smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Doc Miller looked up from his ledger, wire spectacles perched low on his nose. Ezra Holloway, haven't seen you in, 2 years? Not since that fence post took a slice out of your leg. Ezra nodded. Need some supplies, Doc. Privately. Miller's eyebrows rose, but he led Ezra to his back office, closing the door. The examination table's paper crinkled as Ezra leaned against it. Got someone hurt out at my place. Woman. Bad beaten. Ribs might be cracked. Needs tending, but won't come to town. The doctor frowned. Woman who... rather not say just yet. Ezra, Miller sighed, removing his spectacles. You know I can't just... The front door banged open. Voices filtered through, Sheriff Pike's distinctive drawl, and another, smoother voice that sent a chill down Ezra's spine. Judge Blackwood, Miller whispered, confirming Ezra's fear. He's been in a state since yesterday, looking for something. Someone, Ezra corrected quietly. The doctor's eyes widened in understanding. Ezra, what have you done? Before he could answer, the inner door swung open. Sheriff Pike filled the doorway, hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Behind him stood Judge Harlan Blackwood, impeccably dressed despite the frontier town surroundings. The rings on his right hand caught the light, exactly as Sarah had described. Well now, the judge said, voice honey smooth. Ezra Holloway, just the man I've been hoping to find. The sheriff's boot heels clicked against the wooden floor as he stepped aside. Whispers from the waiting room patients filtered through the open door. Judge, Ezra acknowledged, keeping his face neutral. Something I can help with? Blackwood smiled, all teeth and no warmth. Perhaps. I seem to be missing someone. Young woman, dark hair, might be injured. Been asking after her since yesterday? Lots of folks pass through, Ezra replied. Don't see many myself, out at my place. Interesting. Blackwood removed his gloves, one finger at a time. The leather made a soft, sucking sound against his skin. Because one of my ranch hands thought he spotted someone matching her description near your east pasture yesterday morning. Ezra held the judge's gaze. Your men riding my boundary lines now, Judge? A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's face before the smile returned. Missing property has a way of commanding attention, Mr. Holloway. Property, Ezra repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. Indeed. Blackwood nodded to Sheriff Pike, who produced a folded document from his vest pocket. The judge took it, unfolding it with deliberate care on Miller's desk. The paper crackled, heavy with official seals. Sarah Lawson, contracted as household help, 5-year indenture, honors signed and legal. Ezra didn't look at the paper. Folks don't usually run from good situations, Judge. Ungrateful ones do, Blackwood replied smoothly, especially after all I've provided. Room, board, protection from unfortunate circumstances. Doc Miller cleared his throat. Judge been asking after a missing woman, Ezra. All official-like. Ezra caught the careful emphasis in the doctor's tone, the silent warning. If you've seen her, Blackwood continued, the law obligates you to inform me. Harboring contractually bound servants is a serious offense. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Miller's desk clock. Outside, the blacksmith's hammer continued its steady rhythm. Blackwood stepped closer, close enough that Ezra could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. I'd hate to see a man of your standing face legal troubles, Mr. Holloway, especially with your own property situation being so precarious. My property's secure as they come, Ezra said. Worked by my hands 30 years. The judge's smile widened. He slapped another document onto the desk. A land deed, Ezra's name on one corner, but the boundary lines drawn differently than he remembered. There seems to be some confusion about your eastern boundary, Mr. Holloway. Mr. Holloway. My surveyors have discovered a discrepancy. According to this amended filing, that creek belongs to my holdings, not yours. Ezra felt the blood drain from his face. Without that creek, his cattle would have no water access. His ranch would be worthless. She's my property, Holloway, indentured fair and square. And if you don't produce her, that land will be mine too. Ezra stared at the document, his throat dry as creek sand in August. The boundary lines had been redrawn, claiming nearly 50 acres of his land, including the critical water access. This ain't right, he managed finally. That survey's wrong. The territorial office has already recorded it, Blackwood replied, adjusting his ruby ring with a practiced twist. But I'm a reasonable man. Return my property, the girl, and we might resolve this boundary issue amicably. Doc Miller stepped forward, spectacles flashing in the lamplight. Judge, if I might inquire, why come to my office seeking her? A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's face. She's prone to accidents, might need medical attention. I see. Miller's tone remained neutral, but Ezra caught something in his eyes, a careful assessment, a doctor's practiced observation. The judge gathered his papers, tucking them into a leather portfolio that smelled of oil and wealth. I expect to hear from you by sundown tomorrow, Mr. Holloway. Sheriff Pike will be available to escort the girl back to my residence. He paused at the door. Or to enforce the new property lines. The bell above the doctor's door jangled as they left. Through the window, Ezra watched townsfolk scurry out of Blackwood's path, hats doffing respectfully. Power commanded its own gravity in these parts. What have you gotten yourself into, Ezra? Miller murmured once they were alone. Ain't about me. Ezra's voice was granite. It's about what's right. Miller sighed, rubbing his forehead where his spectacles had left red marks. That girl at your place? She hurt bad? Ezra nodded. Ribs for certain, maybe more I can't see. I should examine her. The doctor began packing his medical bag, glass bottles clinking against each other, the room filled with the medicinal smell of iodine as he added a brown bottle. Not just for her sake. If what I suspect is true, what do you suspect, Doc? Miller glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. This isn't the first household help the judge has gone through. 3 in the past 2 years, all with frequent accidents. The ride back to the ranch stretched longer than before. Every hoofbeat seemed to carry Blackwood's threat. The doctor followed on his own horse, medical bag secured to his saddle. Neither man spoke much, nothing to say that would change what lay ahead. Sarah was exactly where Ezra had left her, though she'd managed to sweep the cabin floor despite her injuries. The broom still leaned against the wall. Her eyes widened with fear at the sight of Doc Miller. It's all right, Ezra assured her. Doc's here to help. She shook her head. He'll tell. They always tell him. Not this time, Miller said gently, setting his bag on the table. The leather creaked as he opened it. I'm here as a doctor, nothing else. It took nearly an hour to coax her into accepting an examination. Ezra stepped outside during the most intimate parts, standing guard on the porch. Through the open window, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath as Miller pressed on her ribs. The afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders, warming the worn cotton of his shirt. When the doctor called him back inside, his face was grim. The cabin smelled of alcohol and salve. 3 ribs bruised, not broken. Various contusions and lacerations, some older than others. Miller's clinical tone didn't match the anger in his eyes. Sheriff's outside, Ezra. Must have followed us. Ezra's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle above the door. Miller shook his head slightly. Let me handle this, he murmured. Sheriff Pike's spurs jingled as he stepped onto the porch. His mustache twitched with poorly concealed satisfaction. Found her, I see. Medical call, Miller replied smoothly. Mrs. Jenkins at the general store mentioned Mr. Holloway was looking poorly last week. Thought I'd check on him. And the woman? Pike's hand rested on his holstered pistol. My cousin, Ezra said flatly. From Kansas. Widowed last spring. Pike's eyes narrowed. Judge seems mighty sure she belongs to him. Judge is mistaken, Miller interrupted. I've examined this woman as part of my duties. She's suffering from injuries that need continued treatment. He stepped closer to Pike, lowering his voice. Injuries that would raise difficult questions if reported officially. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. Even Pike, deep in Blackwood's pocket, had limits to what he'd enforce. "I'll need to report to the judge," he said finally. "Tell him I'm treating a patient," Miller replied. "That's all he needs to know for now." After Pike left, the cabin fell silent except for the ticking of Ezra's old clock. Sarah sat at the table, wrapped in a quilt despite the warm day, fingers tracing the wood grain. "Sheriff, I need a private word with Mr. Holloway," Miller said suddenly. Ezra followed the doctor outside. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the yard. Chickens pecked lazily in the dust. "I've been keeping records," Miller said quietly, pulling a small notebook from his inner pocket. The leather was worn smooth from handling. "Started after the second girl. Thought I was being paranoid until the third one." He opened the book. Inside, in neat doctor's handwriting, were clinical descriptions of injuries, dates, patterns. Rebecca Simmons, 1876. Fractured wrist, bruised kidney, torn. Miller stopped himself. Claimed she fell downstairs. Anna Green, 1877. Broken collarbone, burns on both palms, bruising consistent with. He closed the book. Each one lasted about 6 months before disappearing. Moved back east, and the judge would say. Ezra's mouth went dry. And folks just accepted that? Who'd question a territorial judge? Miller tucked the notebook away. Been keeping notes on his housekeepers for years, just never had the courage to use them. The next morning arrived with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. Ezra made coffee, the familiar routine, steadying his hands. The pot bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Sarah sat at the table, her posture straighter than the day before. Doc Miller's medicine had taken the edge off her pain. "Judge gave me till sundown," Ezra said, pouring her a cup. The ceramic was warm against his fingers as he set it before her. Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug, absorbing its heat. "You should turn me over," she said quietly. "Save your land." "Land's just dirt." Ezra sat across from her. "Ain't worth a person's suffering." A knock at the door sent Sarah shrinking back into her chair. Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before Doc Miller's voice called out, "It's just me, Ezra." The doctor entered, medical bag in hand, his face grave. "Sheriff's been asking questions. We don't have much time." Miller set his bag on the table, the leather creaking as he opened it. Glass vials clinked against each other. "Miss Sarah, I need to conduct a more thorough examination today, to document everything properly." Her face went pale. "Everything?" "I'll be clinical and quick," Miller promised. "But if we're to have any chance of stopping him, we need evidence." Ezra stood. "I'll wait outside." "No," Sarah's voice was surprisingly firm. "I need you to stay. Please, just turn your back." The examination proceeded with Miller's gentle, professional detachment. He worked methodically, dictating his findings in a low voice as he wrote in his ledger. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound besides Sarah's occasional sharp intake of breath. "Contusions on both wrists consistent with restraints," Miller noted. "Circular burn marks on lower back, approximately the size of a cigar tip. Multiple partially healed lacerations on upper thighs." Ezra kept his gaze fixed on the cabin wall, counting the knots in the pine boards. His hands clenched into fists, then released, over and over. "Miss Sarah," Miller said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to check for injuries. In your private areas, your symptoms suggest possible trauma there." A long silence followed. "He said it wasn't," Sarah's voice cracked. "He said it wasn't wrong because I belonged to him. The contract gave him rights to—" The pencil in Miller's hand snapped. He cleared his throat, regaining his professional tone. "I'll be extremely gentle. You can stop me at any time." Ezra closed his eyes, jaw clenched so tight his teeth might crack. The clock ticked. A breeze rattled the window. Outside, a mourning dove cooed, oblivious to the human suffering within. "Internal lacerations consistent with forced entry," Miller dictated quietly. "Evidence of repeated trauma. Inflammation indicating possible infection." He paused. "These injuries matched 3 previous cases." When the examination finally ended, Miller helped Sarah dress, then stepped outside with Ezra. The mid-morning sun felt obscenely bright after the darkness they'd witnessed inside. "It's worse than I thought," Miller said, voice low. "That man is a monster, Ezra. What he's done to her, and likely to the others before her." "Can your records help her?" "They might, if I can get them before a real judge, not just the local magistrate who's in Blackwood's pocket." Miller rubbed his face. But that would mean taking this all the way to the territorial capital. Weeks of legal battles. Then that's what we'll do. Miller looked pained. Ezra, you don't understand. Blackwood has connections throughout the territory, friends in high places, and that land dispute gives him legal leverage over you. Don't care about the land. You should. Without it, where would you take her? How would you support yourself, let alone protect her? Before Ezra could answer, the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. 3 riders approached from the direction of town. Sheriff Pike in the lead, flanked by 2 men Ezra recognized as Blackwood's ranch hands. They're coming, Ezra muttered. Get back inside, Doc. Stay with her. The riders halted at the edge of the yard. Pike dismounted first, spurs jingling as he approached. His hand rested on his holstered pistol. Holloway, he called. Got business with you. Ezra stepped forward, careful to keep his hands visible. What kind of business, Sheriff? Pike pulled a document from inside his vest. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. By order of the Territorial Court, I'm here to inform you that your property boundaries have been officially adjusted. He gestured toward the eastern pasture. That creek and everything east of it now belongs to Judge Blackwood. That paper's based on a false survey, Ezra said evenly. Pike shrugged. Take it up with the court. He nodded to one of Blackwood's men, who rode toward the creek, a wooden stake and sign visible in his saddlebag. What's he doing? Ezra demanded. Marking the new boundary, Pike replied. Judge's orders. Ezra started toward his horse, but Pike stepped in front of him. Wouldn't do that if I were you. Interfering with a court order is an arrestable offense. They watched in helpless silence as the man hammered the stake into the ground near the creek bank. The dull thud of each blow carried across the pasture. The sign, when he attached it, was clearly visible, even from a distance. Property of Judge Harlan Blackwood. No trespassing. That water's all I've got for my cattle, Ezra said, his voice tight. You know that. Judge knows it too, Pike replied. There was something almost like sympathy in his eyes. That's why he's offering you a deal. He handed Ezra another document. This one bore Blackwood's personal seal pressed into red wax. The paper felt heavy, expensive, against Ezra's calloused fingers. Return the girl by sundown, Pike explained, and the judge will grant you continued access to the creek. Limited access, mind you, but enough to water your stock. And if I refuse? Pike's gaze drifted toward the eastern pasture, where Blackwood's men were already stringing barbed wire along the new boundary line. The metal barbs glinted in the sunlight. Then as of tomorrow morning, any cattle found drinking from that creek will be shot as trespassing livestock. Pike mounted his horse. Judge asked me to tell you one more thing, Holloway, his exact words. Choose Holloway, the woman or your land. The dust kicked up by the departing riders had barely settled when Doc Miller emerged from the cabin. His face was grim as Ezra explained what had happened. So he's cutting off your water unless you hand over Sarah, Miller summarized. Despicable, but clever. My cattle will die without that creek. Ezra's voice was flat. 30 years building this place, and he'll destroy it in a day. Inside the cabin, they found Sarah standing by the window. She'd been watching. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she turned to face them. I heard, she said quietly. I'll go back. You shouldn't lose everything because of me. Ezra shook his head. You go back, and you'll be dead inside a month. We both know it. There must be another solution, Miller said, removing his spectacles to clean them with a handkerchief. The glass caught the afternoon light. Some legal recourse? Against a territorial judge? Ezra snorted. With what money? What connections? Sarah moved to the table and sat down carefully, mindful of her ribs. Her fingers traced the wood grain, following a knot that spiraled like a question mark. There's something I need to show you, she said finally. Her hand moved to her throat, pulling out a thin leather cord hidden beneath her borrowed shirt. At the end hung a small metal locket, tarnished with age. The clasp stuck, requiring her thumbnail to pry it open. Inside wasn't the expected portrait, but a folded scrap of paper, brittle with age. She handled it delicately, spreading it on the table. It was a fragment of a document, torn, but the official seal still visible in one corner. My father's land deed, she explained. My real name is Sarah Lawson. That deed he has is forged. Ezra and Miller leaned closer. The fragment showed boundary lines and landmarks drawn in faded ink. Lawson, Miller repeated. Any relation to Jeremiah Lawson? Had the big spread east of here before the war? Sarah nodded. My father. He died when I was 14. Mother passed 2 years later. The bank foreclosed, at least that's what I was told. Her fingers touched the fragment reverently. This is all I managed to save before Judge Blackwood's men cleared us out. They said the taxes weren't paid, but I saw Mother pay them just before she died. Ezra studied the fragment. These markings, this shows your family's land sharing a boundary with mine, east of the creek. Yes, the land Judge Blackwood now claims. Miller's eyes widened. Sarah, if this is authentic, it proves Blackwood forged the documents to steal your family's property. And now he's trying to take Ezra's connecting parcel to cover his tracks. But it's just a fragment, Ezra pointed out. Might not hold up legally. Sarah's eyes hardened with a resolve that transformed her face. There's more. In my father's ledger, he sketched the entire property from memory. Every boundary, every landmark. He made me memorize it in case anything ever happened. She took a piece of paper from Miller's notebook and began to draw, her movements precise despite her injuries. Lines took shape, creek beds, ridge lines, property markers. Her fingers stopped at a particular bend in the creek. This is how I know the deed is forged. This curve in the water, my father called it Devil's Elbow. It's on our side of the property line, not Blackwood's. That creek boundary proves the forgery. Ezra studied her drawing. Hope, small but persistent, flickered in his chest for the first time in days. Even if you're right, we'd need evidence, official records. The county clerk might have copies, Miller suggested, replacing his spectacles. Old Augustus Green has been keeping records for 30 years. If the original deed exists, he'd know. Blackwood's got him frightened like everyone else? Ezra countered. Sarah straightened, wincing slightly at the pain in her ribs. Then we find someone he hasn't frightened yet. Her voice had found a new strength. I won't let him take another piece of what's mine, or yours. That evening, while Sarah rested, Ezra and Miller sat on the porch, speaking in low voices as they formulated a plan. The sunset painted the western sky in fierce oranges and reds, a battle of colors. County records first, Miller decided. I can visit Green tomorrow, say I'm researching old property lines for a medical thesis on well water. What about Sarah's contract? Ezra asked. Even with property evidence, he'll still claim she's legally bound to him. Indenture contracts require valid consideration, Miller replied. If she was forced to sign under duress, or if the terms are unconscionable, he stopped. My brother's a lawyer in Denver. I'll telegraph him for advice. As darkness fell, Ezra checked his rifle, then the locks on the doors and windows. Sarah watched him from where she sat by the fire, her face golden in its light. You don't have to fight for me, she said softly. Ezra continued his security rounds, his movements practiced and methodical. Not just fighting for you, he replied. Fighting for what's right. Man's got to stand for something in this world. Most men stand for whatever's easiest. Ain't interested in easy, Ezra said, finally sitting in the chair opposite her. The firelight caught the silver in his beard. Interested in sleeping at night. Sarah studied him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. The weathered face, the careful hands, the eyes that held her gaze without demanding anything in return. Some things worth fighting for ain't on no deed, she whispered. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Ezra heard the wagon approaching. He was already awake, had been for hours, sitting with his rifle across his knees. The distinctive creak of wooden wheels rolling over hard-packed dirt brought him to his feet. Doc Miller's wagon emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, the doctor himself at the reins. His face was grim as Ezra helped him down. You've got trouble, Miller said without preamble. The smell of town still clung to his clothes, tobacco smoke and coal dust. Judge has been busy. Inside, Sarah had awakened at the noise. She sat at the table, wrapped in Ezra's spare quilt, her face pale in the lamplight. Miller nodded a greeting, then continued bow. Blackwood's telling everyone you abducted Sarah, says you're holding her against her will, that she's delirious from fever and confused about who's trying to help her. Ezra's jaw tightened. Town believing him? Some are, others aren't sure. Miller removed his hat, turning it in his hands. The felt was worn smooth along the brim. But that's not all. He's claiming you're taking advantage of her condition, suggesting improper relations. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound for a long moment. He's poisoning the well, Ezra said finally, making sure nobody believes her if she speaks out. Exactly. Miller set his hat on the table. And it's working. Half the town's scandalized, the other half's just waiting to see what happens. No decent folk will help him now. Ezra poured coffee, the pot scraping against the iron stovetop. The familiar ritual steadied his hands. Did you get to the county records? Miller shook his head. Green wouldn't let me see them, said they're sealed by judicial order, Blackwood's order, specifically. He accepted the cup Ezra offered, warming his hands around it. But I did speak with my brother by telegraph. He's clear that an indenture contract can't legally permit physical abuse, regardless of its terms. Not much comfort if Blackwood controls the courts, Ezra observed. We need proof beyond Sarah's testimony and my medical records, Miller agreed. Something that directly ties Blackwood to document fraud. The sun was rising as they finished their coffee, painting the eastern sky with pale pink light. Ezra moved to the window, watching as his cattle drifted toward the now forbidden creek, his livelihood, dying of thirst while water flowed just beyond reach. I have an idea, he said suddenly, but I'll need to go to town. Sarah straightened. I'm coming with you. Too dangerous, Ezra and Miller said simultaneously. I've been hiding for days, she replied, her voice firm despite its softness. And what has it gotten us? The judge spinning tales, turning people against us. I need to be seen, show I'm not being held against my will. If Blackwood spots you as he won't expect me to be there openly. I stood, still favoring her ribs, but straighter than before. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. An hour later, they were on the road to town. Sarah and Doc Miller in his wagon, Ezra on horseback alongside. They'd fashioned a disguise of sorts for Sarah. One of Ezra's shirts as a loose jacket, her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. Not enough to fool a close inspection, but sufficient to avoid immediate recognition. Piney Creek was bustling with Saturday morning activity. Farmers' wagons lined the main street, loaded with produce for market day. Children darted between adults, playing tag in the dusty street. The blacksmith's forge was already roaring, the rhythmic clang of his hammer punctuating the morning bustle. Heads turned as they passed. Whispers followed. Ezra kept his gaze forward, jaw set, though he heard the words clearly enough. Improper. Taking advantage. Poor confused girl. At the blacksmith's yard they stopped. Jacob Turner, the smith, looked up from his work, sweat glistening on his massive forearms. The forge's heat pushed against them like a living thing, carrying the sharp scent of hot metal and coal. Holloway, Turner acknowledged with a nod. Doc, and... His eyes narrowed at Sarah, then widened slightly in recognition. Need a private word, Jacob, Ezra said quietly. Turner glanced around, then gestured them inside his workshop. The interior was dimly lit, tools hanging from every available space. A half-finished horseshoe glowed orange on the anvil. You're taking an awful risk bringing her to town, Turner murmured, closing the door behind them. You recognize her then, Miller said. Course I do. She's the judge's... She's no one's property, Ezra interrupted, his voice like granite. Turner studied Sarah, really seeing her for the first time. The fading bruises visible at her collar, the careful way she held herself to protect her ribs. Something shifted in his expression. What do you want from me? He asked finally. Ezra stepped forward. You made the judge's seal, didn't you? The one he uses on official documents. Turner's face closed off. I make lots of things. Jacob, Miller pressed, we're not here to cause trouble for you, but that man has hurt people, is still hurting people, and using forgery to cover his tracks. You don't know what you're asking, Turner muttered. He's a territorial judge. Crosses him, and a man could lose everything. Already losing it, Ezra replied. My water, my livelihood. Sarah's lost her family land, her freedom, nearly her life. Sarah stepped forward, removing her hat. Her face was pale, but determined in the forge's orange glow. Please, she said simply. Turner turned away, busying himself with tools that didn't need organizing. Metal clinked against metal as he moved things around. Finally, he spoke without turning. I didn't just make his seal, he admitted. I made his printing press, the one he uses for official documents. Man thinks because I've got strong arms, I must have a weak mind. Never bothers hiding what he's doing when I'm around. He turned back, something different in his eyes. I've seen him forge deeds, court orders, contracts. Watched him practice signatures till he could copy them perfect. Them ink stains don't lie. I made the press he uses. Would you testify to that? Miller asked. Turner laughed bitterly. And hang myself? I made the tools he uses to commit fraud. Or you help us prove it, Ezra countered, and you're the craftsman who exposed corruption. Turner considered this, absently rubbing an old burn scar on his hand. There's something else you should know. That press he uses? It's got a flaw. Tiny nick in the frame that leaves a mark on every document. Bottom right corner, looks like a half moon. It's on everything he's printed these last 3 years. Sarah gasped. My indenture contract has that mark. So does Ezra's boundary adjustment, Miller added, eyes widening. If we could find the original deeds for comparison. Judge keeps the originals, Turner said quietly. Locked in his office safe. Says he needs to reference them. But really, he's making sure nobody can compare them to his forgeries. The ride back from town weighed heavier than the journey in. Ezra's thoughts churned like storm clouds. Turner's revelation about the printing press was valuable, but the safe in Blackwood's office might as well have been in China for all their chances of accessing it. They took a circuitous route home, avoiding the main road where Blackwood's men might be watching. The wagon wheels crunched over fallen pine needles as they wound through the forest. Birds called overhead, oblivious to human troubles. We know what to look for now, Miller said, breaking the long silence. The half-moon mark proves the forgery. Proves nothing if we can't get to the originals, Ezra replied, his voice hollow. And even if we could, who'd take our word over a judge's? Sarah sat quietly beside Miller, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The disguise had worked in town, but Ezra had seen the toll it took. The way she flinched when strangers came too close. How she'd pressed against the blacksmith's wall when men's voices grew loud outside. Back at the ranch, Ezra's cattle clustered near the fence line, lowing plaintively. They could smell the creek water just beyond reach. By tomorrow, he'd need to start hauling water from the well, back-breaking work that wouldn't sustain the herd for long. Inside the cabin, Ezra moved mechanically, building a fire against the evening chill. The strike of flint against steel echoed in the quiet room. Sparks caught the kindling, flames licking upward. I'm heading back to town, Miller announced. Need to check on a patient and gather more supplies. I'll return by morning. When the doctor had gone, Sarah approached Ezra, who stood staring into the fire. You're thinking of giving up, she said quietly. Not an accusation, just an observation. Ezra didn't deny it. 30 years I've worked this land. Built something from nothing. His voice was rough with emotion. If the herd dies, there's nothing left. And if you turn me over? I'd never do that. Then what's your plan? Ezra moved to the trunk at the foot of his bed. The hinges creaked as he opened it, revealing neatly folded clothing, a few books, a daguerreotype in a tarnished frame. He began removing items, placing them on the bed. Colorado, maybe, he said, not meeting her eyes. Or California, somewhere Blackwood's reach doesn't extend. He held up the daguerreotype, a younger version of himself standing beside a plain-faced woman with kind eyes. My Rebecca, lost her 15 years ago, fever, always talked about seeing the ocean. Sarah watched him pack, her face unreadable. Maybe some fights ain't meant to be won. The words hung in the air between them. Ezra continued methodically organizing his few possessions, a lifetime distilled into what could fit in a saddlebag. Outside, a coyote called, lonely in the gathering dusk. Would leaving stop him? Sarah asked finally. Would it save the next girl, or the next rancher whose land he wants? Ezra's hands stilled. One man can't fight the whole system. My father used to say that systems are just men standing together. Sarah moved to the stove and placed the coffee pot on it, her movements careful but purposeful. The familiar domestic action seemed out of place amid talk of flight and surrender. And sometimes, all it takes is for men of good conscience to stand together too. While the coffee brewed, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, Sarah continued. When he first brought me to his house, Judge Blackwood showed me a painting in his study, Napoleon on horseback. He said it was worth more than most men earn in a lifetime. Man does love his possessions, Ezra muttered. That's just it. He sees everything, every one, as possessions, things to own, to use, to discard. The coffee pot began to bubble, releasing steam. But possessions can be taken away. That's what he fears most. Ezra looked up from his packing, really seeing her for the first time that evening. Despite her injuries, despite everything she'd endured, Sarah stood straight, her eyes clear and determined. You still want to fight, he realized. I want justice, not just for me, but for every girl before me. For your land. For everyone he's stolen from. She poured coffee into 2 cups, the liquid black as midnight. But I can't do it alone. She crossed to where Ezra sat, surrounded by his worldly possessions, and placed a cup in his weathered hands, a mirror of their first interaction days ago. The ceramic was warm against his skin, the scent of coffee rising between them. Doc believes in us, she said softly. Turner too, in his way. We're not alone in this fight. Ezra stared into the cup, seeing his reflection ripple in the dark liquid. He thought of his cattle, thirsting for water just beyond their reach. Of Sarah, bearing wounds both visible and hidden, of Blackwood, sitting in his fine house, surrounded by possessions bought with other people's suffering. Running won't bring your land back, Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. It won't heal what he's done, it just gives him another victory. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called, the sound carrying through the night air. My Rebecca, Ezra said slowly. She would have liked you. She never ran from a fight either. He took a sip of the coffee, the familiar bitter warmth steadying him. When he looked up, decision had replaced doubt in his eyes. Judge thinks he owns this county, he said. Maybe it's time someone showed him different. Sarah's lips curved into a small smile. So we stay and fight. We stay and fight, Ezra confirmed. He set the cup down carefully. But we do it smart. Blackwood, he's used to people fearing him, hiding from him. What he won't expect is for us to face him openly. Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. A public confrontation. In front of witnesses, where he can't hide behind closed doors and legal papers. Ezra's voice grew stronger with each word. Some things worth fighting for ain't on no deed. Morning brought Doc Miller back to the ranch, along with news that made their hastily formed plan suddenly urgent. Blackwood's called a special court session, he announced as he entered, bringing the smell of town dust and leather with him. His boots left dried mud tracks on the wooden floor. Noon today, claims it's about water rights and property boundaries, but everyone knows it's about Sarah. Ezra's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, the steam curling in the still air. Today? Ain't giving us much time to prepare. He's not wasting time, Miller confirmed, setting his hat on the table with a soft thump. Wants to settle this before we can mount any real defense. Words spread through town like wildfire. Or before Sarah's bruises fade completely, Ezra added grimly. Harder to deny what folks can see with their own eyes. They gathered around the table, voices low as they refined their strategy. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, each sound marking another moment slipping away. Sarah sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, a calmness about her that belied the danger ahead. You don't have to do this, Ezra told her, his weathered hand briefly touching the table near hers. Could be dangerous. Blackwood won't take kindly to being challenged in public. Sarah's fingers traced a worn groove in the pine tabletop. I've faced worse than public scorn, she replied, meeting his eyes. Much worse. By 11, they were on the road to town, the horses' hooves raising small puffs of dust with each step. Sarah rode beside Ezra on his spare mare rather than hidden in Miller's wagon. No more hiding, they'd decided. The bright midday sun left no shadows to conceal their approach as they rode down Piney Creek's main street. Townspeople stopped and stared. A woman pulling a child from the general store gasped audibly, clutching the little one closer. 2 men outside the barbershop whispered behind their hands, the razor strop forgotten in one's grip. The blacksmith, Turner, paused mid-hammer, the unfinished horseshoe cooling on his anvil as he watched them pass with a grim nod of acknowledgement. The courthouse, a 2-story structure of pine and local stone, stood at the end of the street like a final judgment. Its steps were already crowded with spectators, drawn by rumors of the special session. The murmur of voices grew louder as they approached, then fell to hushed whispers. Sheriff Pike stood at the entrance, thumbs hooked in his belt, silver star catching the sunlight as he spotted their approach. Quite a turnout, Miller observed as they dismounted. Boot heels thudded against packed dirt, stirrups jingling. Blackwood must have spread the word. Good, Ezra said, adjusting his hat against the noon sun. More witnesses. They climbed the courthouse steps, the wood creaking beneath their weight. Each step brought a fresh wave of whispers from the gathered crowd. Pike moved to block their way, one hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol, leather creaking beneath his fingers. Court's in session for property matters, he said, voice pitched to carry to curious ears. Nothing that concerns you folks. My property's on the docket, Ezra replied evenly. And Miss Lawson here has a direct interest in the proceedings. Something flickered in Pike's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first stirrings of conscience, before he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Judge won't like this, he muttered, just loud enough for Ezra to hear. Inside, the courthouse hummed with murmured conversations that abruptly died as they entered. The sudden silence was deafening. Wooden benches lined both sides of a center aisle filled with the curious and the concerned. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny stars. The smell of polished wood, paper, and too many bodies in too small a space hung in the air. At the front, behind a raised desk of polished oak, sat Judge Harlan Blackwood. He looked up from his papers, face momentarily registering shock at seeing Sarah before smoothing into judicial calm. His rings caught the light as his hands flattened on the desk. 4 distinct bands, exactly as Sarah had described. The ruby on his index finger gleamed like a drop of blood. "Mr. Holloway," he said, voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is an official proceeding regarding property boundaries. I don't recall summoning you." "Property matters concern me directly, Your Honor," Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. The floorboards creaked as he stepped forward into the center aisle, especially when they involve land that's rightfully mine, or Miss Lawson's. A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk like wind through prairie grass. Women leaned toward each other, whispering behind gloved hands. Men straightened, suddenly more attentive. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath his cleanly shaven cheek. "Miss Lawson is confused about many things," he said smoothly, though his fingers now gripped the edge of his desk. "Her presence here is inappropriate and disruptive to these proceedings." Sarah stepped forward to stand beside Ezra. The movement caused her to wince slightly, a small tell that didn't escape the notice of those in the front rows. "I'm not confused, Your Honor," she said, her voice stronger than many expected. "Just no longer afraid." The judge's gavel cracked against wood like a gunshot. Several people jumped. "Order. This court will maintain proper procedure." He nodded to a nervous-looking clerk. "Continue reading the adjusted property boundaries." "Your Honor," Ezra interrupted, his voice rising above the clerk's stammering. "Before these adjustments are finalized, there's evidence this court should hear." Blackwood's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "Evidence is submitted through proper channels, Mr. Holloway, not shouted across my courtroom like some barroom dispute." Doc Miller stepped forward, medical bag in hand. The leather creaked as he gripped it tighter. "The evidence concerns more than property lines, Judge Blackwood." The bag made a solid thunk as he placed it on the table before the judge's bench. "It concerns a pattern of abuse and document forgery that can no longer be ignored by decent folk." The room fell silent, save for the measured ticking of the wall clock and the sound of Miller withdrawing his ledger. Someone coughed nervously. A child whispered a question, quickly hushed by its mother. The worn leather notebook seemed inconsequential against the official trappings of the court, yet Blackwood's eyes fixed on it like it was a coiled rattlesnake. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, his voice tight, knuckles whitening around his gavel. "Sheriff, remove these disruptors immediately." Pike hesitated, looking between the judge and the growing interest of the townsfolk. Behind him, Turner the blacksmith stood, arms crossed over his massive chest, forge-strengthened muscles visible even beneath his Sunday shirt. "Let's hear what they have to say, Judge," Turner called, his deep voice resonating through the room. Several voices murmured agreement, the sound growing like distant thunder. Blackwood's face flushed crimson. "This is my courtroom." "It's the people's courtroom," Ezra cut in, stepping closer to the judge's bench. His boots struck the floor with deliberate emphasis. "And then people deserve to hear the truth about the man judging their disputes and their lives." Ezra turned to face the gathered crowd, his weathered face solemn in the filtered sunlight streaming through the high windows. Dust motes danced around him as he took a deliberate step forward. "Judge Blackwood claims my eastern boundary belongs to him," he began, voice gaining strength with each word. "Claims he owns Miss Lawson through an indenture contract." His calloused hand gestured toward Sarah, who stood straight despite her pain. "But them papers are forged, just like the ones he used to steal the Lawson family ranch years ago." The courthouse erupted in whispers, the sound like dry leaves rustling in autumn wind. Women leaned toward one another, eyes wide. Men shifted uncomfortably on the hard benches. Blackwood's gavel pounded repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing off the pine walls, startling a bird that had somehow found its way inside. It fluttered frantically near the ceiling. "These are serious accusations," the judge thundered, spittle flying from his lips. His rings flashed as he gripped the gavel tighter. "Without a shred of evidence, I won't have my court turned into a circus by desperate land-hungry ranchers and their—" His eyes flicked dismissively toward Sarah, confused companions. "There's evidence aplenty," Ezra replied, standing his ground as the bird finally found the open window and escaped to freedom. "The doctor's records, the blacksmith's testimony about your printing press, and then marks on Miss Lawson's body, marks that match the rings on your right hand." A woman in the front row gasped, clutching her companion's arm. Someone toward the back muttered, "Shameful if true." The sound of shifting feet and rustling clothing filled the momentary silence. Miller stepped forward, opening his ledger. Pages crackled as he found his place, the sound cutting through the tense atmosphere. The leather cover creaked as he folded it back completely. "I've documented injuries on 4 women over the past 3 years, all in Judge Blackwood's household service." His finger traced the neat handwriting, voice shifting to the dispassionate tone of medical testimony. "February 10th, 1877, Rebecca Simmons. Contusions on both wrists, consistent with restraint, fractured left ulna, burn marks on lower back approximately 1/2 inch in diameter." He turned the page, the paper whispering against his fingers. "September 4th, 1877. Anna Green, broken clavicle, finger-shaped bruising on neck and thighs, lacerations to lower regions requiring 16 stitches." Each clinical description landed like a physical blow in the silent courtroom. A mother covered her young daughter's ears, face pale with shock. "The pattern is unmistakable," Miller continued, "and matches exactly the injuries currently visible on Miss Sarah Lawson, as well as those I've documented but cannot speak of in mixed company." He approached the bench, placing the open ledger before the judge. "Your Honor, these records show a pattern no accident explains." Blackwood barely glanced at the pages, his face flushing deeper. "A doctor's wild speculations prove nothing," he snapped, shoving the book away. It slid across the polished surface, nearly falling before Miller caught it, leather slapping against his palm. "I've treated these women, Judge," Miller insisted, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Heard their terrified explanations, watched them disappear once they'd healed enough to speak the truth." From the back of the room, Turner's deep voice carried forward like distant thunder. "Tell him about the press, Judge. The one I made for you. The one with the half-moon flaw." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. The blacksmith moved forward, each heavy footstep echoing on the wooden floor. His massive frame seemed to fill the aisle as townsfolk leaned away. "Every document that press prints has a tiny mark in the bottom right corner," Turner continued, raising his hand to demonstrate the size. "A half-moon shape from where the frame's damaged. Told you it needed fixing 2 years back, but you said it wasn't worth the trouble." His eyes narrowed. "Now I reckon I know why." He pointed to the clerk's desk. "Check them boundary papers. The mark'll be there." The nervous clerk fumbled with the documents, holding one up to the light streaming through the window. The paper glowed amber, translucent. His eyes widened behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "There is a mark, Your Honor, just as he described." "A coincidence," Blackwood dismissed, but his voice had lost its authority. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air in the courthouse. He tugged at his collar, leaving a smudge on the once pristine white. "No coincidence," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her boots made a soft thud on the wooden floor. The room hushed at her clear voice, all eyes turning to this woman they'd heard so many rumors about. She reached into her collar, pulling out the locket that hung on its thin leather cord. The tarnished metal caught the light as she opened it with a soft click, revealing the deed fragment. "This is part of my father's original deed. The real boundaries are different from what the judge claims." She turned to the gathered townspeople, scanning their face. "My father was Jeremiah Lawson. Many of you knew him." Heads nodded in recognition. "A fair man who paid his debts." Her voice trembled slightly but remained strong. "Judge Blackwood claimed our land after my parents died, said we hadn't paid taxes. But we had. My mother paid them just before she fell ill." An elderly woman in the second row nodded vigorously. "I remember Elizabeth Lawson," she called out. "Saw her at the county office myself that spring." Blackwood rose so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, his face mottled with rage, veins standing out on his temples. "This is absurd. The girl is clearly delusional." "She ain't delusional, Judge," came another voice, quavering with age, but determined. Augustus Green, the elderly county clerk, stood shakily near the back door, papers yellowed with age clutched in his gnarled hands, trembling slightly. Found these in the old files. Tax receipts for the Lawson property. Paid in full, just as she says. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. The sound swelled like a flash flood, uncontainable. Sheriff Pike looked uncertainly between the judge and the mounting evidence. His hand had fallen away from his pistol, thumb now hooked in his belt as if trying to appear casual. That contract you claim gives you ownership of Miss Lawson, Ezra pressed, sensing the tide turning. Show it to the court. I don't need to justify. Show it. And the demand came from multiple voices now, a chorus of righteous anger building from every corner of the room. Sunrise painted the eastern sky in strokes of gold and amber as Ezra sat on his porch, steam rising from the coffee cup, cradled in his weathered hands. 2 weeks had passed since the courthouse confrontation. 2 weeks of whispers becoming conversations, of justice grinding its slow but certain path. Judge Blackwood now sat in a territorial prison cell awaiting trial. His fine house stood empty, its expensive paintings and furnishings cataloged as evidence. The territorial governor had dispatched a circuit judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair and clear eyes, to review all of Blackwood's previous rulings. The creak of the door announced Sarah's presence before she appeared beside him, her own coffee cup warming her hands. She moved more easily now, her ribs healing, the visible bruises faded to memory. She settled into the second rocking chair, the one Ezra had built in the days following the trial. The wood complained softly beneath her weight. Creek's running high today, she observed, looking out over the eastern pasture where cattle grazed freely on both sides of the water. The morning light caught the ripples, turning them to liquid gold. Spring melt, Ezra replied. Good for the land. They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, sipping the bitter brew. A pair of meadowlarks called to each other across the distance. The scent of pine and damp earth rose from the ground as the sun's warmth touched it. Augustus Green stopped by the general store yesterday, Sarah said finally. Says they've found 12 more cases of Blackwood falsifying deeds, folks getting their land back. Ezra nodded. Justice moves slow, but it moves. When it has witnesses, she added quietly. The word hung between them, weighted with all they'd been through. Witness, to see and acknowledge truth, no matter how painful, to stand before others and say, this happened. Your land's papers cleared yesterday, Ezra said. Green said to tell you it's officially yours again, Lawson property, just like before. Sarah's fingers tightened around her cup. Feels strange, like inheriting a memory. What will you do with it? She considered this, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Haven't decided yet. It's good grazing land. Maybe run some cattle. Her eyes met his. Would need experienced help, though. The unspoken question lingered in the morning air. Ezra took another sip of coffee, buying time to steady his voice. Reckon I could offer some advice, he said carefully. Being neighbors and all. Just advice? A smile touched the corners of her mouth. Ezra set his cup down on the porch rail, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wood. Sarah, I'm an old man, set in my ways. You've got your whole life ahead. My whole life, she interrupted gently, that I have because of you. She reached across the space between their chairs, her hand finding his. Some choices define a man, Ezra Holloway. You chose to help me when most would have looked away, chose to fight when running would have been easier. A blush crept up his weathered neck. Just did what was right. And that's exactly why... She stopped, reorganizing her thoughts. I'm not asking for promises or forever, just possibility. Two neighbors helping each other, seeing where time takes us. The morning light caught the silver in Ezra's beard as he nodded slowly. Reckon I could manage that. Later that day, they visited the boundary line where their properties met. The survey stakes had been reset according to the original deeds, marking what belonged to each of them. Shari knelt at the line, digging small holes with a trowel. What are you planting? Ezra asked, watching her work. Wildflowers, she replied, placing tiny seeds in each hole. Border flowers, they're called. They don't respect property lines, just bloom where they're planted and spread beauty on both sides. As she covered the last seed with soil, Ezra understood the simple truth they'd both learned. Some wounds heal with time, others with justice, but the deepest healing comes through finding connection after isolation, trust after betrayal, home after being lost. The law was just paper until decent folks stood behind it. Love was just a word until tested by fire. And freedom, real freedom, was the ability to choose one's own path forward, to plant seeds of possibility and watch them grow.